Eleanor Madison believed her $80 million private jet had died on the runway. Inside the hangar, the company's most experienced engineers surrounded the silent aircraft, running every diagnostic they knew. One after another, the systems reported nothing that could explain why the engine refused to start. Yet every failed attempt brought Eleanor closer to losing the most important meeting of her career. A government delegation was already waiting in Washington. By noon, they were expected to sign a contract worth more than Madison Aerospace Systems had earned during the previous 3 years. If she failed to arrive, the agreement would almost certainly collapse, and with it, the future of the company her father had spent a lifetime building. Then a poor single father named Mason Reed quietly walked through the side entrance of the hangar. He carried an old toolbox in one hand and a clipboard in the other. He hadn't been called to repair the aircraft. His assignment was far less important, or so everyone believed. He had been hired to inspect a section of concrete floor that had been vibrating for weeks. No one paid attention to him. No one even knew his name. When Mason stopped beside the aircraft, knelt on the hangar floor, and drew 3 small chalk circles, several engineers exchanged puzzled looks before breaking into quiet laughter. To them, the subcontractor inspecting the floor had just embarrassed himself in front of the entire company. 7 minutes later, the engine came back to life, but Mason hadn't repaired the airplane. He had uncovered the first piece of a carefully planned act of sabotage, one designed to let the aircraft leave the ground looking perfectly safe, only to fail thousands of feet in the air. And before that morning was over, those 3 simple chalk circles would expose the one person Eleanor Madison had trusted more than anyone else inside her company. The private airfield outside the city was still wrapped in early morning cold when the hangar lights flickered on above Eleanor Madison's $80 million jet. Rain from the night before had not fully dried on the runway, and a thin mist clung to the tarmac while the aircraft sat under white floodlights, silent and waiting for a flight that was supposed to decide the future of an entire company. Eleanor stood near the boarding stairs in a charcoal coat, phone pressed to her ear, listening as her assistant confirmed that the government delegation in Washington would not wait past noon. The contract on the table was worth more than Madison Aerospace Systems had earned in the last 3 years combined. If she failed to arrive in time, the deal would collapse. And with it, very likely her position at the head of the company her father had built from nothing. Connor Vale walked beside her with the practiced calm of a man who knew how to sound reasonable while pushing for exactly what he wanted. He suggested, not for the first time that morning, that Eleanor grant him temporary signing authority so she would not have to travel under pressure. Eleanor brushed the suggestion aside, though something in his persistence had begun to feel less like loyalty and more like rehearsal. She climbed the short metal staircase, nodded to the pilot, and gave the order to begin the pre-flight sequence. The pilot turned the ignition switch. Nothing happened. He tried again. The engine gave a faint cough, a brief shudder through the fuselage, and then silence fell across the hangar. Lucas Grant, the company's senior maintenance engineer, rushed forward with 2 technicians already pulling diagnostic tablets from their bags. He assured Eleanor that the aircraft had passed full inspection the previous evening. Every system had been signed off. Whatever was happening now, he insisted, had to be a sudden and unpredictable mechanical failure. Eleanor's jaw tightened. She had personally reviewed the maintenance logs less than 12 hours earlier. Connor remained unusually composed through the commotion. He suggested again, gently this time, that he handle the Washington meeting in her place. Eleanor studied him for a moment longer than necessary, then turned back toward the disabled aircraft. Behind them, near the edge of the hangar, a quiet figure entered through the side door carrying a worn toolbox and a clipboard for a minor repair to a vibrating section of floor. Mason Reed had not been invited into the crisis unfolding around the aircraft. He was only a subcontractor brought in for a small structural complaint filed weeks earlier. Nobody in that hangar knew his name. Nobody had reason to look twice. But Mason had already heard something in the engine's failed cough that none of the engineers seemed to be listening for. Mason set his toolbox down near the wall, and began the floor inspection he had actually been hired to perform. He was not an employee of Madison Aerospace Systems, only a subcontractor assigned to investigate a minor vibration complaint that had been pushed to the bottom of every maintenance list until that morning. Nobody paid attention to him. Every eye in the hangar remained fixed on the silent aircraft, and the engineers gathered around its open engine compartment. But Mason had already noticed something that none of them seemed to hear. When the engine had briefly coughed before falling silent, the sound had carried more than a simple mechanical failure. Beneath the noise of hurried footsteps, radios, and anxious voices, he could still distinguish a faint rhythm that did not belong. Years earlier, he had learned that machines rarely failed without warning. They whispered first, revealing themselves through the smallest inconsistencies long before they broke completely. He stayed where he was, listening instead of rushing toward the aircraft. Slowly, he walked across the concrete floor, pausing now and then to study the surface beneath the landing gear. A thin ring of dust had settled in an unusual pattern, and the faint vibration beneath his boots seemed slightly out of rhythm with everything else inside the hangar. Lucas noticed him first. Already frustrated by the failed diagnostics, he called across the hangar and warned Mason to stay away from the aircraft. One of the younger engineers glanced toward the quiet subcontractor and laughed as Mason crouched to examine the concrete instead of the engine. To everyone watching, he looked like a man paying attention to the only thing that did not matter. Mason ignored the remarks. He continued moving slowly across the floor, touching the concrete from time to time, and listening with the same quiet concentration that had drawn him there in the first place. Eleanor saw him almost by accident. While the engineers argued over possible mechanical faults, she noticed the stranger kneeling several yards away with far more interest in the floor than in the aircraft itself. Curious, she walked over. "What exactly are you doing?" she asked. Mason did not stand. He answered calmly, without taking his eyes off the concrete. "An engine can lie to a diagnostic screen," he said. "A floor rarely lies to someone who knows how to read it." The words drew amused smiles from several engineers. Lucas stepped forward and reminded Eleanor that Mason was not an aviation engineer. He was simply an outside contractor hired to inspect a vibration in the hangar floor. Nothing more. Eleanor remained silent. There was no confidence in Mason's voice, no attempt to impress anyone, no promises that he could solve what her engineers could not. There was only an unusual calm that seemed untouched by the growing panic around him. For reasons she could not explain, she did not ask him to leave. Instead, she watched as Mason slowly rose to his feet and looked once more toward the aircraft. "May I borrow a piece of chalk?" he asked quietly. For the first time that morning, Connor's expression changed. He immediately suggested that security remove the unauthorized contractor before he delayed the inspection any further. Eleanor raised a hand, stopping the discussion before it could continue. She turned to the nearest technician. "Give him the chalk." No one understood why she had made that decision, least of all the engineers who believed the quiet man standing beside them was about to make himself the subject of the morning's biggest joke. A technician hurried back with a piece of white inspection chalk and placed it in Mason's hand. Without another word, Mason walked toward the front landing gear. He crouched beside the aircraft and studied the concrete for several seconds before drawing a slow circle around a faint horseshoe-shaped pattern in the dust. He moved to the secondary fuel compartment and stopped again. Beneath his boots, the floor carried the slightest vibration, almost too weak to notice unless someone was listening for it. He drew a second circle. Finally, he crossed to the engine support strut. A thin trace of fluid barely reflected the overhead lights. Most people would have dismissed it as residue left from routine maintenance, but Mason examined it carefully before marking a third circle. The three white circles stood out sharply against the gray concrete. To everyone else in the hangar, they meant nothing. Several younger technicians laughed openly. Even Lucas could not hide his disbelief. "What exactly are three chalk circles supposed to fix?" he asked loudly. "We've spent the last 20 minutes running every diagnostic system on this aircraft." Mason rose to his feet and brushed the dust from his hands. "The circles aren't here to repair the aircraft," he said quietly. "They're here to show us where someone has been lying." The laughter stopped. An uneasy silence spread across the hangar as every pair of eyes turned toward the three circles. Eleanor stepped closer. "How much time do you need?" 7 minutes, Mason replied. "But no one touches the controls unless I ask." Connor immediately objected. Every additional minute, he argued, pushed the company closer to losing the government contract. There was no reason to trust an outside contractor over an experienced engineering team. Eleanor looked from Connor to Lucas, then back to Mason. The engineers had already tried everything they knew. She had nothing left to lose. "You have 7 minutes." Mason nodded once. He asked one technician to shut down the auxiliary pump. Another was instructed to open the pressure valve. Finally, he requested that the protective cap beside the engine mount be removed. Lucas hesitated, but Eleanor's order left no room for debate. The hangar gradually fell silent as the auxiliary pump shut down. The steady mechanical hum faded, allowing Mason to hear the system more clearly. The first minute passed. Nothing happened. During the second minute, a pressure gauge twitched, almost imperceptibly before settling again. Mason pointed toward the instrument. Lucas frowned. It was a tiny fluctuation, small enough to ignore under normal circumstances. Yet, it appeared directly where Mason had drawn the first chalk circle. By the fourth minute, Mason discovered a thin layer of fresh sealant hidden beneath the protective cap. It looked almost identical to the surrounding surface, but unlike the older material, it had not yet collected the same layer of dust. Carefully examining the area, he uncovered a small reversing valve installed where no such component should have existed. Instead of removing it, Mason temporarily bypassed the altered section and asked the pilot to try the ignition once more. The pilot turned the switch. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then the engine shuddered. A deep vibration rolled through the aircraft before the turbines accelerated into a smooth, powerful roar. One by one, the warning lights disappeared from the cockpit display. No one spoke. The only sound inside the hangar was the steady rhythm of an engine that only minutes earlier had seemed impossible to restart. Eleanor let out the breath she had been holding. "You fixed it." Mason looked at the running engine for a moment before quietly shaking his head. "No, the engine will run." He turned to face Eleanor. "But you should never be on this aircraft when it leaves the ground." The words settled over the hangar far more heavily than the engine's roar. For the first time that morning, the failed engine no longer seemed to be the real danger. The roar of the engine gradually settled into a steady rhythm, but no one inside the hangar celebrated. Every engineer stood motionless, staring first at the aircraft, then at Mason. Eleanor broke the silence. "If the engine is running, why can't I fly?" Mason looked back toward the open engine compartment before answering. "Because whoever caused this wasn't trying to stop your flight." He paused. "They wanted your flight to begin." The words struck the room harder than the failed engine ever had. Lucas frowned. "Explain." Mason walked back to the third chalk circle and pointed toward the newly discovered reversing valve. This component wasn't installed to prevent ignition. It was installed to deceive the diagnostic system. He looked directly at Eleanor. Once the aircraft reached cruising altitude, fuel pressure would gradually become unstable. The engine wouldn't fail immediately. It would appear to be a natural mechanical malfunction. The realization spread across the faces around him. An accident, not a malfunction. A carefully designed accident. Eleanor felt the weight of those words settle in her chest. Someone hadn't tried to delay an important meeting. Someone had tried to make sure she never arrived. Without hesitation, she turned towards security. "Lock every hangar door. No one leaves. And preserve every security recording from midnight until now." Connor stepped forward immediately. "Eleanor, that's unnecessary. We're already losing valuable time. We can investigate after the Washington meeting." She didn't even look at him. "The meeting can wait. My engineers just discovered someone tried to turn my aircraft into a coffin." The hangar fell silent again. Security officers immediately moved to secure every entrance, While technicians disconnected the aircraft from ground support equipment, Lucas knelt beside the engine, carefully examining the newly exposed valve. "The installation is almost invisible," he admitted quietly. "It would have passed every routine inspection." Mason nodded. "That was the intention." Lucas slowly looked up. "Whoever did this knew exactly how our inspection process works. They understood this aircraft, and they knew how to avoid being detected." Eleanor's expression hardened. "So this wasn't an outsider." Mason answered carefully. "It would have required authorized access and detailed technical knowledge." Neither statement accused anyone directly. Neither comforted the room. Lucas suddenly remembered something. The maintenance log. He hurried toward a nearby workstation and opened the digital inspection records from the previous night. Everything appeared normal. Every inspection had been completed. Every checklist had been signed. Then Mason quietly pointed toward the final entry. "Look at the timestamp." Lucas frowned. The last inspection had supposedly been completed shortly after midnight. His face slowly lost its color. "That's impossible. I wasn't here." Several technicians turned toward him. Lucas quickly opened his phone calendar before pulling up the company's access records. "I left the facility before 10 o'clock. I had dinner with my family. I couldn't have signed this inspection." The digital signature carried his name, his employee identification, even his encrypted authorization, but it wasn't his. Someone had used his credentials. Connor folded his arms. "Identity theft isn't impossible. Someone could have copied your access." Lucas shook his head. "The signature alone isn't enough. Whoever entered the engine compartment also needed physical access." Mason continued scrolling through the maintenance records. Nothing seemed unusual, until one detail caught his attention: a 12-minute gap. One of the security cameras covering the eastern maintenance bay had stopped recording for exactly 12 minutes during the same period the forged inspection had supposedly taken place. He looked toward Eleanor. "That isn't a coincidence. The inspection record, the missing camera footage, and the hidden valve, they all happened during the same window." For the first time that morning, Eleanor stopped thinking like a CEO racing to save a contract. She began thinking like someone investigating an attempted murder. She slowly closed the maintenance log and looked around the hangar. Every face now carried the same question: if the sabotage required company credentials, if the inspection record had been forged, if the security cameras had been disabled, then the person responsible wasn't outside the company. They were already standing somewhere inside the building, and they had almost succeeded. No one moved. The steady hum of the engine continued behind them, but it no longer commanded anyone's attention. Every eye in the hangar had shifted from the aircraft to the growing collection of evidence surrounding it. Eleanor looked at Mason. "If someone inside this company planned all of this." She paused. "How did you recognize it so quickly?" Mason remained silent for a moment before answering. "I've seen this kind of failure before. It wasn't an accident then either." He offered nothing more. His expression made it clear that whatever experience he was referring to belonged to a chapter of his life he had no desire to revisit. Samuel Pierce, the company's longtime legal counsel, had arrived only minutes earlier after receiving Catherine Blake's urgent call. Quietly observing the scene, he studied Mason for several seconds before something in his memory resurfaced. "Were you once part of the Falcon Defense Propulsion Program?" The question caught several people by surprise. Mason slowly nodded. "I was." Samuel exhaled softly. "I remember the investigation. Years earlier, Mason had warned senior management about a vibration anomaly inside an advanced military engine. His reports had been ignored until the system eventually failed during testing. Rather than admit their own mistakes, executives shifted the blame onto the young analyst who had first raised the warning. Mason left the aerospace industry soon afterward. He disappeared from the corporate world, choosing a quiet life far away from boardrooms, contracts, and executives who preferred convenient answers over uncomfortable truths. Silence filled the hangar once again. Lucas lowered his eyes. Only an hour earlier, he had laughed at the man standing before him. Now he understood why Mason had trusted the evidence more than the diagnostic computers. Eleanor also understood something she hadn't seen before. Mason wasn't trying to prove he was the smartest person in the room. He was trying to prevent another disaster from repeating itself. Catherine interrupted the silence. "I've finished reviewing the overnight access records." She handed a tablet to Eleanor. "Every employee entry is accounted for, except one." The screen displayed a single badge access near the restricted maintenance area shortly after midnight. Connor Vol. Connor barely glanced at the report. "My badge was probably cloned. It happens. It proves nothing." Mason calmly looked at the timestamp. "Perhaps. But cloning a badge doesn't explain who knew exactly where to install that valve." Connor answered immediately. "Anyone with enough technical knowledge." Lucas shook his head. "No." He pointed toward the exposed engine. "That modification required detailed knowledge of this aircraft. It wasn't random. It was calculated." Catherine opened another security report. The Eastern camera stopped recording for exactly 12 minutes. The interruption began 30 seconds after Connor's badge entered the restricted area. Connor remained composed. "That camera has malfunctioned before." Samuel stepped forward. "So has your explanation." No one smiled. The room had become far too serious for that. Eleanor crossed her arms while studying Connor's face. For years, she had trusted him with confidential negotiations, board meetings, acquisitions, and every major strategic decision inside the company. Now every memory suddenly demanded to be questioned. Connor sensed the shift immediately. "Eleanor, you've known me for nearly 20 years. Are you really going to believe an outside contractor over your own executive team?" Before Eleanor could answer, Mason quietly spoke. "This isn't about trust. It's about evidence." He pointed toward the maintenance records. A forged inspection, a missing security recording, a hidden valve, 3 separate events, 1 timeline. He let the words settle. "They're connected." Lucas slowly nodded. "I agree." Every engineer who had examined the aircraft since the engine restarted had reached the same conclusion. None of the damage could have happened by accident. Someone had planned it. Someone with access. Someone with experience. Someone inside Madison Aerospace Systems. Eleanor finally made her decision. She looked toward Catherine. "Freeze every access credential. Secure every maintenance record. Notify the board. I want an emergency meeting immediately." Connor's expression remained calm, but for the first time that morning, the confidence behind his eyes had begun to disappear. Across the hangar, Mason quietly looked back at the 3 chalk circles still visible on the concrete floor. They had never been about repairing an airplane. They had marked the beginning of a trail that now led directly toward the person who had hidden behind authority for years. And before the day was over, that trail would end inside the boardroom. Within 20 minutes, every member of Madison Aerospace Systems board had joined an emergency video conference. Large monitors were rolled into the hangar, allowing directors from across the country to witness the investigation exactly as it unfolded. Connor spoke first. His voice remained calm and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, this morning's mechanical incident has unfortunately escalated because an unauthorized contractor has interfered with a critical inspection. As a result, we've delayed an important government signing and exposed the company to unnecessary financial risk." Several board members immediately questioned Eleanor's decision. "The Washington delegation is waiting. Shouldn't we focus on completing the contract first?" Connor nodded. "Exactly. The aircraft has already been restarted. There's no reason to continue disrupting company operations." Eleanor remained silent. Instead, she turned toward Mason. "Show them." Without raising his voice, Mason walked toward the aircraft and stopped beside the 3 chalk circles that still marked the concrete floor. "The engine was never the real problem," he began. "It was only the bait." He pointed toward the first circle. This vibration sensor had been deliberately altered. It produced readings that appeared normal during standard inspections while masking pressure instability. He moved to the second circle. This fuel line was manipulated to behave perfectly on the ground. But once the aircraft reached cruising altitude, the pressure imbalance would continue growing until the engine failed. Finally, He stopped beside the third circle. The fresh sealant concealed a reversing valve that did not belong to this aircraft. It wasn't designed to stop the engine from starting. It was designed to let the aircraft leave safely before failing when recovery would no longer be possible. Silence filled the conference. Lucas stepped forward. My engineering team has independently confirmed every one of these findings. The modifications could not have occurred during routine maintenance. Samuel Pierce immediately displayed another document. The maintenance log from last night contains a forged inspection completed under Lucas Grant's credentials. Lucas looked directly at the board. I did not perform that inspection. I wasn't even on company property. Catherine Blake then opened the security access records. Only one executive badge entered the restricted maintenance area during the relevant time period. Connor Valle. Connor didn't hesitate. My badge was cloned. Anyone could have copied it. Mason calmly nodded. Perhaps, but a cloned badge cannot explain technical knowledge. He displayed photographs of the hidden valve. This modification required detailed familiarity with this exact aircraft. It also required access to confidential maintenance procedures. Samuel added another piece of evidence. The Eastern security camera stopped recording exactly 30 seconds after Connor's badge entered the restricted zone. Connor's confidence finally began to crack. Coincidences happen. They don't prove sabotage. Before anyone else could answer, Catherine projected a newly recovered email onto the large monitor. The room fell completely silent. It showed confidential flight information forwarded to an external address the previous night. Attached to it was a draft acquisition proposal, prepared by a rival aerospace company. The timestamp preceded the engine failure. Several board members leaned closer to their screens. Samuel slowly closed the email. The acquisition plan assumed Eleanor Madison would never complete today's contract. Connor immediately stood. This proves nothing. It's taken completely out of context. Mason quietly asked one final question. If your badge was cloned, if your emails were fabricated, if your inspection records were forged, then why was every piece of evidence created to benefit only one person? Connor had no answer. At that exact moment, Catherine received another notification from the security team. A low-angle maintenance camera, believed to have failed months earlier, had partially recorded activity inside the engine bay. The footage was unclear. The figure's face couldn't be seen, but the reflection captured on the polished engine housing revealed the person's height, posture, and distinctive movement. Lucas watched only a few seconds before speaking. I know that posture. So do I, Samuel answered quietly. Every eye turned toward Connor. His composure finally disappeared. He looked around the hangar, searching for someone willing to defend him. No one moved. No one spoke. Eleanor slowly stood. For 20 years, I trusted you. Connor lowered his eyes. The evidence had spoken more clearly than any accusation ever could. Without another word, two company security officers walked forward. This time, Connor didn't resist. The board voted unanimously to suspend Connor Vail from every executive responsibility pending the criminal investigation. Before the meeting ended, his company accounts, security credentials, and financial authority were permanently revoked. No one attempted to defend him. The evidence had left no room for doubt. For several long moments, the hangar remained completely silent. Eleanor looked toward the aircraft that had nearly become her final flight. Only hours earlier, she had been focused on reaching Washington before noon. Now she understood that arriving safely had mattered far more than arriving on time. She turned to Mason. You saved my life. Mason gently shook his head. I only listened. The aircraft was warning everyone. We simply weren't listening. Those simple words stayed with everyone in the hangar. Lucas stepped forward. The engineer who had laughed at Mason only that morning extended his hand. I owe you an apology. I judged your jacket instead of your knowledge. I won't make that mistake again. Mason accepted the handshake without hesitation. There are no shortcuts in safety. We all learn. Samuel Pierce soon confirmed that the government delegation had agreed to postpone the signing after receiving a complete report explaining the attempted sabotage. Rather than losing confidence in Madison Aerospace Systems, They praised the company's decision to expose the truth instead of hiding it. 2 days later, Eleanor completed the agreement that had nearly been lost forever. Before the board meeting concluded, she made one final announcement. Madison Aerospace Systems would establish an independent flight safety division with the authority to stop any aircraft, inspection, or executive decision whenever a genuine safety concern existed. The department would answer directly to the chief executive officer. Then, she looked at Mason. "I'd like you to lead it." Mason remained quiet for several seconds. He had never wanted recognition. He had never been searching for another executive title. What mattered to him was making sure that no warning would ever be ignored again, simply because it came from the wrong person. Finally, he nodded. "I'll accept, but only if safety always comes before schedules." Eleanor smiled. "You have my word." Several weeks later, a framed photograph appeared on the wall of the new Flight Safety Division. It showed nothing extraordinary, only 3 small chalk circles drawn on a concrete hangar floor. To visitors, they looked meaningless. To everyone who had witnessed that morning, they represented the 7 minutes that saved a life, protected a company, and exposed a betrayal hidden behind years of trust. Sometimes the smallest details reveal the greatest truths. Sometimes the quietest voice is the one worth hearing first. And sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the only one who can see the danger before it becomes a tragedy. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more Learn English Through stories, filled with mystery, courage, and unforgettable life lessons. Every new story is another opportunity to improve your English while discovering characters whose quiet integrity changes lives. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.